I didn't just find a stranger in my house at 3 in the morning. I found my replacement answering my front door wearing my robe. Most men would have thrown a punch. I didn't. I watched him run. Then I walked into my kitchen, poured a glass of wine, and realized that my wife hadn't just cheated on me. She had handed me the weapon I needed to destroy her entire family's legacy. I wasn't going to get even. I was going to get everything. I got home at 3 in the morning. The flight from London to O'Hare had been canceled due to a mechanical failure over the Atlantic, forcing us to turn back, but I managed to catch a miracle connection that landed me in Chicago hours before anyone expected me. The airport felt like a tomb, empty echoes bouncing off the polished floors, and the taxi ride back to the suburbs was a blur of neon lights and exhausted anticipation. I had spent the last 48 hours fixing a disaster for a client in the UK, sitting through meetings that could have been emails, and sleeping on uncomfortable chairs. All I wanted was my bed. I wanted the smell of my sheets and the warmth of my wife, Chloe. That simple desire was the last innocent thought I would ever have. My flight was not supposed to land until 10 the next morning. No one, especially Chloe, expected me back. That thought should have been comforting, a surprise waiting to happen. It was not. As the taxi pulled away, leaving me standing on the sidewalk with my leather satchel, I noticed how every street looked staged, as if the world had been paused, and only I was moving through it. The silence of the suburbs usually brought me peace, but tonight it felt heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. I glanced at our house. It was a beautiful colonial build we had bought 2 years ago with help from her father, Robert. Every light was off except one. The warm glow spilling through the curtains of the living room window struck me as odd. Chloe was a heavy sleeper. She never left lights on downstairs. I smiled for a split second, thinking she had fallen asleep reading a book again. But as I unlocked the front door, the metal bolt clicked loudly in the silence, and something strange happened. The door did not just unlock, it was yanked open from the inside. A man I had never seen before stood in my doorway. He was barefoot, wearing nothing but jeans that were hastily buttoned, and his chest was bare. He looked disheveled, confused, and for a terrifying second, he looked at me like I was the intruder. He froze like he had seen a ghost. I stood on my own porch, gripping the handle of my bag, my mind trying to process the visual data in front of me. This was not a burglar. Burglars do not answer the door. He blinked, his eyes darting to my face, then to the bags in my hand. Then he shouted toward the hallway behind him, his voice loud and dangerously casual, like he owned the place. He yelled back that someone was here to see her. That was when I heard it. Chloe's voice. It was groggy, playful, the voice she used when she was trying to get out of waking up on a Sunday morning. She told him to tell whoever it was that she was asleep. The sound of her voice shattered the last fragment of my denial. The man hesitated, realizing the gravity of the mistake he had just made. He muttered something breathless under his voice, brushed past me, and sprinted toward his car parked down the street. He did not look back. I could have stopped him. I could have dropped my bag and tackled him onto the manicured lawn. I could have broken his nose. But I did not. I just stood there. The silence after he left was unbearable. It was the kind of silence that does not fill a house. It empties it. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. The latch clicked, and the sound echoed like a gunshot. Chloe appeared in the hallway a moment later, wearing one of my oversized dress shirts. Her hair was messy, her face pale and flushed with sleep. She looked confused at first, rubbing her eyes, but when her focus adjusted and she saw me standing there in my coat, still holding my luggage, the confusion curdled into pure terror. She asked why I was home early. She asked it like an accusation, as if my arrival was the crime. I said nothing. I walked past her, the scent of her perfume mixed with a cologne that was not mine hitting me as I moved. I sat down at the kitchen table and placed my phone face down in front of me. I wanted her to feel every second of that silence. I wanted her to suffocate in it. She began spinning stories, each one more pathetic than the last. First, she claimed it was the neighbor checking on a noise. Then, she said it was her cousin stopping by for an emergency. Then, she panicked and said she did not know who the man was. The words came out fast, one lie tripping over another, desperate and sloppy. I did not respond to any of them. I just watched her. I watched the woman I had promised to spend my life with unravel into a desperate stranger. The stillness made her panic faster than shouting ever could. After a while, she started crying. She asked if we could talk in the morning, begging that she would explain everything if I just gave her time. I told her I would stay just for tonight. Her relief was instant, and it was disgusting. She thought my calmness meant forgiveness. She thought she had survived. She went upstairs eventually, fleeing the tension. I stayed downstairs. I stared at the half-empty glass of wine on the counter and the faint lipstick stain on the rim. Next to it lay a set of car keys the man had left behind in his panic. A small metallic emblem glinted under the kitchen pendulum light. It was an engraved logo of Sterling Construction, her father's company. I held the keychain in my hand for a long time, the cold metal biting into my palm. I had worked for that company as a junior consultant 5 years ago, before I started my own firm. I knew everyone in upper management. I turned the keys over. There was a small tag with a vehicle identification number and a name scribbled on a piece of masking tape on the back. Justin. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Justin Wardell. He was the newly appointed project manager for the downtown redevelopment, the biggest contract Sterling Construction had ever landed. He was married, had 2 kids, and had a reputation for cutting corners and taking credit for other people's work. He was arrogant, flashy, and exactly the kind of man Chloe used to make fun of. But then, another thought struck me, colder and sharper than the betrayal itself. I remembered seeing a silver sedan parked 2 houses down when my taxi pulled up. It had a parking permit for the city planning zone on the dashboard. I stood up and walked to the window. The car was gone, but something about the timing did not add up. Justin lived 40 minutes away in the north suburbs. Why would he risk coming here, to my house, when my flight was only delayed, not canceled initially? They had gotten sloppy. They had gotten comfortable. I sat back down and opened my laptop. I did not log into social media. I logged into our joint bank account. My chest felt hollow, but my mind was operating with a terrifying, electric precision. I scrolled back through 3 months of transactions. Hotel bookings in her name, charged to my secondary card. Dinners at restaurants she claimed she went to with her mother. But then I saw something else. Large cash withdrawals. $5,000 here. $3,000 there. All from our savings. This was not just infidelity. This was funding a lifestyle she could not afford, or worse, funding him. I looked deeper. There was a transfer of $10,000 to a consulting firm I did not recognize. I ran the name of the firm through the state registry database. It had been registered only 4 months ago. The registered agent? Justin Wardell. My wife was not just sleeping with her father's employee. She was funneling money to him. And given that she had access to her father's personal accounts as a trustee, I realized with a sick clarity that this might go far beyond my bank account. If Justin was using her to siphon money from Sterling Construction, this wasn't just a divorce case. It was federal fraud. I closed the laptop. The sun was starting to rise, painting the kitchen in gray light. I did not feel rage anymore. I felt something far more dangerous. I felt purpose. Chloe thought she could talk her way out of this in the morning. She thought this was a marriage crisis. She had no idea that she had just handed me the blueprints to burn her entire world down. I was an architect. I knew exactly where the load-bearing walls were, and I was going to pull them down, one by one. I stood up, grabbed my bag, and walked out the door before she woke up. I did not leave a note. The game had started, and she did not even know she was playing. I drove to a 24-hour diner near the business district, ordered a black coffee, and made my first phone call. It wasn't to a lawyer. It was to Laura Wardell, Justin's wife. I had found her number in an old company directory I still had on my cloud drive. It was 5 in the morning. She answered on the second ring, her voice thick with sleep. I told her who I was. I told her I had something she needed to see. She asked if it was about the affair. I told her it was about the money. The silence on the other end told me I was right. She knew something, and that meant I had an ally. I hung up and watched the city wake up through the diner window. The first twist of the knife was ready. Chloe and Justin thought they were the only ones with secrets. They were about to learn that secrets are a currency, and I had just become the richest man in town. I walked into my office at 7 in the morning. The city was just starting to grind into motion, the noise of traffic filtering up to the 10th floor of the building where I ran my architectural firm. My staff had not arrived yet, which was perfect. I needed absolute isolation to dismantle the life I had built with Chloe. The first step was not emotional, it was logistical. I sat at my desk, the mahogany cool under my fingertips, and opened a spreadsheet. I treated the end of my marriage exactly like a failing infrastructure project. You do not scream at a collapsing bridge. You secure the perimeter and assess the damage. I started with the money. Chloe had always been terrible with finances, preferring to let me handle the investments while she enjoyed the dividends. That laziness was now my greatest advantage. I logged into our joint brokerage account and initiated a transfer of every single cent of my personal premarital assets into a separate, secure holding account I had opened an hour ago. Then I moved to the credit cards. I reported my primary card as stolen and froze the authorized user account that Chloe carried in her purse. By the time she tried to buy her morning latte to soothe her guilt, the card would be a useless piece of plastic. I left the joint checking account open, but I transferred the balance down to exactly $1. It was petty, perhaps, but it was a message. I wanted her to see that single, lonely dollar and understand that her safety net had vanished. By 9 in the morning, my phone began to buzz. It was Chloe. Then it was her again. Then a text. Then 3 more calls. I watched the screen light up and fade to black, over and over, like a heartbeat monitoring a dying patient. I did not feel the urge to answer. The silence I was inflicting on her was a weapon, forcing her to sit in the uncertainty of what I knew and what I was planning. At 10, I left the office to meet Laura Wardell. We had agreed to meet at a public library downtown, a place quiet enough to talk, but public enough to feel safe. When I saw her sitting at a corner table, she did not look like the woman I remembered from company holiday parties. That woman had been vibrant and laughing. This woman looked hollowed out, her face drawn tight with the exhaustion of someone who had been holding a heavy secret for too long. She had a thick stack of documents in front of her. Laura did not waste time with pleasantries. She pushed the folder across the table toward me. She explained that she had found the papers in Justin's home office 3 weeks ago while looking for tax documents. She had not confronted him immediately because she was afraid, but when I called her, she knew the time for fear was over. I opened the folder. What I saw made the blood in my veins turn to ice. It was not just bank transfers. It was a systematic embezzlement scheme targeting Sterling Construction. Justin had created a network of shell companies posing as material suppliers. There were invoices for high-grade steel that was never delivered, receipts for concrete pouring that never happened, and rental fees for heavy machinery that did not exist. The amounts were small enough to fly under the radar of a casual audit. 5,000 here, 8,000 there, but cumulatively, they added up to hundreds of thousands of dollars over the last year. And on every single authorization form, right next to Justin's signature, was Chloe's. I flipped through the pages, my architect's eye spotting the patterns instantly. They were bleeding her father's company dry. Chloe was using her position as a trustee to bypass the standard compliance checks. She was approving these fake vendors, likely blinding herself to the reality of what she was doing because she was infatuated with Justin. But as I turned to the last page, the narrative shifted from simple greed to something far more sinister. There was a liability waiver for a new residential project, a document that assigned legal responsibility for structural failures to the lead consultant. The signature at the bottom was not Justin's. It was not Chloe's. It was mine. I stared at the looping script of my own name, a perfect forgery of my professional seal. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. They were not just stealing money. They were setting up a fall guy. If the internal audit at Sterling Construction caught wind of the missing funds, the paper trail was designed to lead straight to me. They had used an old consulting agreement I had signed years ago, scanned my signature, and pasted it onto these fraudulent contracts. Justin planned to frame me for the embezzlement. He was going to take the money, take my wife, and send me to federal prison. I looked up at Laura. She saw the realization on my face. She told me she had found a draft of an email on Justin's tablet, addressed to the Sterling Board of Directors, anonymously tipping them off about irregularities involving my firm. They were planning to pull the trigger next week. The timeline made sense now. The cancellation of my flight had thrown off their schedule. If I had come home a week later, as planned, the investigation might have already been in motion. I would have walked off the plane and into handcuffs. A cold, sharp clarity settled over me. This was no longer just about a cheating wife. This was a war for my survival. I told Laura that we needed to move fast. I needed every scrap of evidence she had, digital files, emails, text messages, bank statements. She nodded, her eyes hard. She handed me a flash drive she had kept in her purse. She said she wanted him to lose everything. She did not want alimony. She wanted to watch him crumble. I took the drive and left the library. The city streets felt different now. The buildings I had admired for their design now looked like potential prisons. I drove back to my office, my mind racing through the chessboard of moves I had to make. I could not go to the police yet. The forged documents were too convincing. If I went to the authorities now, it would be my word against a mountain of fabricated paper. I needed undeniable proof. I needed to catch them in a lie that they could not forge their way out of. I spent the rest of the afternoon analyzing the metadata on the files Laura had given me. It was tedious, technical work, but it was the only way to save myself. I traced the IP addresses used to create the fake invoices. They led back to two locations, a coffee shop near Justin's house and, damningly, the Wi-Fi network at my own home. Chloe had been filing these fraudulent documents while sitting on our living room couch, probably while I was sitting right next to her working on legitimate designs. The level of betrayal was so absolute, it was almost impressive. By 6 in the evening, I had built a digital timeline that proved the documents were forged. But I needed more. I needed a confession, or at least a reaction that would expose them in front of the one person who mattered most, Robert Sterling. Chloe's father was a proud man, a traditionalist who valued loyalty above all else. If I went to him with just accusations, he would protect his daughter. I needed to corner them in front of him. I needed a stage. Just as the sun began to set, my phone buzzed with a new message. It was not Chloe this time. It was Robert. He asked if I was back in town and mentioned that he wanted to have a family dinner to discuss the wedding anniversary party he was planning for us. He suggested this Friday. A grim smile touched my lips. It was perfect. The universe was handing me the detonator. I did not reply to Robert immediately. Instead, I opened a new file on my computer and named it The Collapse. I began to organize the evidence into a presentation. I printed the forged signature, the bank transfers, and the text messages Laura had provided. Then, I added one more layer to my plan. I pulled up the schematics for the Sterling construction server architecture. I still had my old admin access codes from when I consulted for them. They had never changed the backend passwords. I logged in remotely, cloaking my connection. I did not steal anything. I simply set up a tracking script on Justin's user profile. I wanted to see every keystroke he made in the next 48 hours. If he panicked, if he tried to move money or delete files, I would have a record of it. As I worked, I saw a notification pop up on the screen. Justin was online. He was accessing the personnel files. He was looking at my file. He was checking to see if my contact information had been updated. He was preparing to launch the accusation. I watched his digital cursor hover over the send button on an email drafted to the legal department. My heart hammered against my ribs. If he sent that email now, the war would start before I was ready. I held my breath. After a long minute, the cursor moved away. He saved the draft and logged off. He was waiting. He probably wanted to finalize the transfer of the last batch of stolen funds before burning me. His greed was his weakness. He wanted one last payday. That hesitation gave me the window I needed. I leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking in the silent office. I was not the victim here. I was the architect, and I was about to design a demolition so precise, so devastating, that when the dust settled, there would be nothing left of Justin Wardell but a cautionary tale. I picked up my phone and finally replied to Robert. I told him I would be delighted to attend dinner. I told him I had a surprise for everyone. The restaurant Robert chose was an institution in Chicago, a place of mahogany paneling, low amber lighting, and steaks that cost more than a mortgage payment. It was where deals were struck and careers were made. But tonight, it would be where a legacy died. I arrived precisely on time, wearing a charcoal suit that was impeccably pressed. I carried nothing but a slim, black leather portfolio. It looked like I was there to discuss a merger. In a way, I was. I was there to merge the truth with the consequences. Robert was already seated at the head of the table, radiating the jovial authority of a man who believed he controlled his universe. Chloe sat to his right, looking fragile and overly made up, her nervous fingers twisting the stem of her wine glass. Justin sat across from her, wearing a suit that was a shade too bright and a watch that was too large. He looked like a man who had already spent the money he hadn't yet stolen. When I approached the table, the air pressure seemed to drop. Justin offered a handshake, a smug gesture of dominance. I ignored it, pulling out my chair and sitting in the silence that followed. I wanted him to feel the snub. I wanted him to know that the dynamic had shifted. The waiter arrived to take our orders, and we performed the macabre dance of polite society. We ordered wine. We discussed the weather. Robert dominated the conversation, talking about the future of Sterling construction and the legacy he hoped to leave behind. He looked at me with genuine affection, calling me the son he never had, praising my stability and my ethics. He spoke about how proud he was that Chloe had married a man of principle. The irony was so thick it tasted metallic. Across the table, Chloe looked like she might be sick, her eyes darting between me and her father. Justin, however, just smiled. He was enjoying this. He thought he was looking at a dead man walking, a fool who was about to take the fall for his crimes. As the appetizers were cleared, Robert brought up the business. He mentioned the new residential tower project, the one Justin was managing, and noted that the profit margins were tighter than expected due to rising material costs. Justin nodded solemnly, launching into a rehearsed speech about supply chain issues and necessary vendor adjustments. He sounded professional, authoritative, and completely fraudulent. He was lying to the man who signed his paychecks, stealing from him with a smile, all while kicking me under the table with his eyes. I waited for him to finish. I waited until he had committed himself fully to the lie. Then, I reached for the black portfolio I had placed next to my plate. The sound of the zipper opening cut through the ambient noise of the restaurant like a saw. I did not speak. I simply slid the folder across the polished wood until it rested directly in front of Robert. Robert looked at the folder, then at me, his brow furrowed in confusion. I gestured for him to open it. He put on his reading glasses and flipped the cover. The first page was a summary I had prepared, titled simply, Unauthorized Fund Diversion and Fraudulent Liability Assignment. The silence that descended on the table as Robert read the first few lines was absolute. It was a vacuum. I watched his eyes scan the data. I saw the moment the confusion turned to shock. He flipped to the next page, the copies of the invoices from the shell companies. Then the next, the bank transfer records showing the flow of money from Sterling accounts to the entities registered by Justin. Robert looked up, his face draining of color. He asked Justin what this was. His voice was not loud, but it trembled with a suppressed frequency of rage that was terrifying. Justin tried to laugh it off. He started to say it was just a misunderstanding, some preliminary paperwork for the new vendors. He reached for the folder, trying to take it back, but Robert slammed his hand down on the table, pinning the evidence in place. That was when I played the ace. I directed Robert to the final section of the dossier. This was the section that detailed the framing. I had included the side-by-side comparison of my genuine signature versus the digital forgery found on the liability waivers. But more importantly, I had included the IT forensic report. It showed the IP logs of the computer used to create the fake invoices and the forgery. It showed clearly that the device was connected to the Wi-Fi network at my home address, at times when I was verified to be out of the country on business trips. The implication was mathematical in its cruelty. Justin could not have accessed my home network alone. He needed an accomplice inside the house. He needed someone with access to my passwords and my physical space. Robert looked at Chloe. He did not need me to explain it. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. His daughter was not just having an affair, she was an active participant in robbing him. She had helped her lover steal from her father's company and had agreed to let her husband take the fall for it. Chloe began to cry. It wasn't a soft weep. It was the ugly, jagged sobbing of a child caught in a lie. She tried to stammer out excuses, claiming she didn't know what she was signing, that Justin had told her it was just tax optimization, that she was confused. But her panic was an admission of guilt. Justin turned on her instantly. In a display of cowardice that was breathtaking, he tried to claim that Chloe had come to him with the plan, that he had been manipulated by her. The table erupted into chaos, but I remained perfectly still. I watched them turn on each other. It was like watching a building collapse in slow motion, the structural integrity failing, the girders buckling, the facade crumbling into dust. Robert stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floor. He looked at Justin with a loathing so deep it seemed to age him 10 years in 10 seconds. He told Justin to get out. He didn't just fire him. He evicted him from his life. He told him that if he wasn't out of the building in 30 seconds, he would have security throw him through the window. Justin scrambled up, grabbing his jacket, his arrogance replaced by the frantic energy of a cornered rat. He looked at me one last time, his eyes full of hate, but he saw nothing in my face to latch onto. I was a blank wall. He fled the restaurant, drawing stares from the other diners. That left just the three of us. Robert sank back into his chair, breathing heavily, clutching his chest. He looked at the dossier again, then at his daughter. Chloe reached for his hand, begging him to listen, but he pulled away as if she were contagious. He asked her if it was true. He asked if she had helped Justin frame me. She couldn't answer. Her silence was the final nail in the coffin. Robert turned to me. His eyes were red, watery, and filled with a profound shame. He apologized. He didn't apologize for his daughter's infidelity. He apologized for the insult to my honor. He apologized for bringing a thief into our family. He told me that he would handle the legal fallout, that he would make sure my name was cleared before the sun came up. I nodded slowly. I didn't offer forgiveness. I didn't offer comfort. I simply closed the portfolio, stood up, and placed a $1 bill on the table to cover my share of the untouched water. It was the same symbolic gesture I had left in our bank account. I told Robert that I would be filing for divorce in the morning and that I expected full cooperation regarding the separation of assets. I looked at Chloe one last time. She was broken, head in her hands, her world dissolved into ruins. I walked out of the restaurant and into the cool night air of Chicago. The adrenaline that had been sustaining me for 24 hours began to fade, replaced by a strange, hollow exhaustion. I had won. I had executed the plan perfectly. I had destroyed my enemies without raising my voice. But as I stood on the sidewalk, watching the city lights blur in the distance, I realized that victory didn't feel like triumph. It felt like survival. I had burned the house down to kill the rats, but now I was the one standing in the ashes. The war was over, but the cleanup was just beginning. I took a deep breath, hailed a taxi, and headed to a hotel. For the first time in 2 days, I was going to sleep, and I would sleep the sleep of the just. The morning after the dinner, I woke up in a hotel room that smelled of industrial cleaner and starched linens. Sunlight was leaking through the heavy curtains, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. For the first time in months, I did not reach for my phone immediately. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the city outside. I expected to feel heavy, burdened by the destruction I had unleashed the night before. Instead, I felt weightless. It was the feeling of a demolition engineer watching the dust settle after a perfectly executed implosion. The structure was gone. Now, I just had to clear the debris. By noon, the first tremors began to shake the foundation of Chicago's construction industry. The news broke faster than I anticipated. Robert Sterling had always prided himself on transparency, but that transparency became his undoing. Following our dinner, he had done exactly what a man of his rigid moral code would do. He self-reported the irregularities to the oversight board. He thought he could control the narrative, frame it as an internal discovery, and save the company's reputation. He was wrong. The market does not care about honesty, it cares about stability. And Sterling Construction had just admitted that its books were cooked. I watched the fallout from the safety of my temporary office. The stock price of Sterling Construction plummeted 40% in 3 hours. It was a bloodbath. Investors panicked. Vendors paused shipments. The reputation Robert had spent 40 years building was evaporating like steam. I did not feel pity. I felt a cold, calculated appreciation for the mechanics of cause and effect. Justin and Chloe had pulled a loose thread, thinking it would just get them a little extra cash. They had no idea they were unraveling the entire tapestry. Justin's downfall was less dignified. He tried to run. Laura called me that afternoon to tell me the news. He had attempted to liquidate his personal accounts and board a flight to the Caymans, but he had moved too slow. I had frozen the assets we shared in the fraud investigation, and Laura had frozen their joint personal accounts. When he tried to swipe his card at the ticket counter, it was declined. 2 federal agents were waiting for him by the time he tried to leave the terminal. The forensic trail I had provided, the IP logs, the forged signatures, the shell company registrations, was airtight. He wasn't just facing civil suits. He was facing federal charges for wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. The arrogant man who had stood in my doorway in his underwear was now sitting in a holding cell, wearing a jumpsuit that fit him just as poorly. Then there was Chloe. She did not disappear quietly. She called my office line 17 times that day. When I blocked the number, she showed up. I saw her from the window of my conference room. She was standing on the sidewalk 10 stories down, looking up at the glass building as if she could see me through the tint. She wasn't the polished socialite anymore. She looked small, desperate, a figure drawn in charcoal against the gray pavement. I instructed security not to let her up. It wasn't cruelty. It was a boundary. I knew what she wanted. She wanted to explain. She wanted to say that she was a victim of Justin's manipulation, that she was confused, that she still loved me. But love does not sign fraudulent liability waivers. Love does not frame you for a federal crime. I turned away from the window and went back to work. I had a plan that went beyond mere revenge. Revenge is emotional. I was interested in acquisition. Sterling Construction was bleeding cash. To stay solvent and pay the mounting legal fees, Robert would have to liquidate assets. He would have to sell off divisions of the company to stop the hemorrhaging. I knew exactly which division would go on the block first, the urban renewal sector. It was the division managing the downtown redevelopment project, the very project Justin had been mismanaging. It was a beautiful project, plagued by incompetence. It had good bones, but it needed a new architect. 3 days later, the liquidation sale was announced. It was a closed-door bidding process, desperate and fast. Robert needed cash immediately to satisfy the creditors. I entered the bidding through a shell corporation I had established years ago for anonymous real estate holdings. I did not want Robert to know it was me. Not yet. I wanted the transaction to be clean, based on numbers, not sentiment. The day of the auction, I sat in my office with my legal team. We watched the digital bids come in. The vultures were circling, picking at the carcass of Sterling Construction, offering pennies on the dollar. I waited. I watched the price drop as other buyers got scared off by the liability issues attached to the project. They saw risk. I saw leverage. I knew the liability was artificial, created by Justin's fraud. Once that was cleared up in court, the project was a gold mine. When the price hit rock bottom, I struck. I submitted an all-cash offer, 20% above the highest bidder, with a clause for immediate transfer of ownership. It was aggressive. It was undeniable. Within an hour, the notification flashed on my screen, bid accepted. I sat back in my leather chair and exhaled. I now owned the project that had been the stage for my betrayal. I owned the building where Justin had planned to frame me. I owned the future that Chloe thought she was stealing. The final twist came a week later. The transfer of ownership documents required a physical signature from the previous CEO to the new owner. I scheduled the meeting at the Sterling headquarters. The building was a ghost town. Layoffs had decimated the staff. Boxes were stacked in the hallways. The air smelled of failure. I walked into the boardroom. Robert was sitting at the head of the table, looking 20 years older than he had at the dinner. He was staring at the paperwork, a pen hovering over the signature line. He thought he was selling his legacy to a faceless investment group. When I closed the door, he looked up. The shock on his face was different this time. It wasn't the horror of discovery. It was the confusion of a man who could not reconcile the reality in front of him. He asked what I was doing there. I told him I was the buyer. I told him that Cole Urban Design, my firm, was taking over the urban renewal division. He dropped the pen. He stared at me for a long time, his eyes searching for malice, for gloating. He found none. He saw only business. He asked me why. Why would I touch anything associated with his name after what his family had done to me? I walked to the window and looked out at the Chicago skyline, the steel and glass rising from the concrete. I told him that I wasn't doing it for him. I wasn't doing it for Chloe. I was doing it because the work was good. The design was solid. It was the people who were flawed. I told him that I was going to strip the project down to the studs, remove the rot, and build it the way it should have been built. Robert signed the papers in silence. His hand shook. When he finished, he slid the documents across the mahogany table. He told me that Chloe had been asking about me. He said she was staying in a small apartment on the south side, that she had no access to her trust fund anymore because it was tied up in the litigation. He asked if I had a message for her. I picked up the folder, the deed to my new empire heavy in my hands. I thought about the woman who had slept in my bed for 5 years. I thought about the silence she had left me in when I walked through that door at 3 a.m. I looked Robert in the eye and told him no. There was no message. The communication was over. I walked out of the Sterling building and into the sunlight. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a notification from my bank. The down payment had cleared. The project was mine. I wasn't just a survivor of the wreckage anymore. I was the builder of the new world. I had taken their chaos and turned it into concrete. And as I walked toward my car, I realized that for the first time in my life, I wasn't building for a client. I was building for myself. The collapse was over. The construction had begun. 12 months passed since the night I sat in that diner watching the sun rise over a city that felt like a prison. 1 year. 365 days. In the world of construction, that is enough time to lay a foundation, erect a steel skeleton, and wrap a structure in glass. It is also enough time to bury a past life completely. The project I had purchased from the ruins of Robert Sterling's empire was finally finished. We renamed it the Meridian. It was no longer a symbol of fraud or failure. It was the tallest residential tower in the district, a sleek needle of silver and blue cutting into the Chicago skyline. It was my design, my money, and my victory. The grand opening was scheduled for a Friday evening, exactly 1 year to the day since I found Justin Wardell standing in my hallway. The symmetry appealed to me. I stood on the penthouse balcony, looking down at the city lights. The air was cold, the kind of sharp, biting wind that comes off Lake Michigan, but I did not feel the chill. I was wearing a tuxedo that cost more than my first car, holding a glass of champagne I had no intention of drinking. Below me, the streets were clogged with limousines and media vans. They were there to celebrate the architect of the year. They were there to celebrate me. The legal fallout had concluded 3 months prior. It was a spectacle, a slow-motion car crash that the local news cycle devoured with ravenous hunger. Justin tried to plead not guilty. He tried to claim he was a scapegoat, a pawn in a larger game. But the evidence was insurmountable. My forensic data, combined with Laura's testimony and the physical paper trail, painted a picture of absolute, premeditated greed. The federal prosecutor did not offer a plea deal. The trial lasted 2 weeks. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. I was there when the verdict was read. I sat in the back row of the courtroom, watching the back of Justin's head. When the judge announced the sentence, 15 years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy, Justin did not scream. He did not cry. He just slumped forward, the air leaving his body as if he had been punctured. The arrogance that had defined him, the swagger of a man who thought he could take whatever he wanted, evaporated in a single second. He was led away in handcuffs, looking back at the gallery one last time. He was looking for someone to save him. He found no one. Laura was not there. She had divorced him, taken full custody of their children, and moved to a quiet town in Wisconsin to start over. She was the only other person who walked away from this with her dignity intact. Chloe's fate was different. She avoided prison, barely. Her father's lawyers managed to argue that she was manipulated, coerced by a senior employee into signing documents she did not understand. It was a humiliating defense, essentially pleading incompetence to avoid criminality, but it worked. She did not go to jail, but she lost everything else. The civil suits drained her accounts. Robert, in a final act of tough love, or perhaps just exhaustion, cut her off completely. The trust fund was gone. The house we lived in was sold to pay legal fees. The social circle she prized so highly ostracized her immediately. In Chicago high society, scandal is tolerated, but poverty is unforgivable. I had not spoken to her since the night at the restaurant. I had not answered a single one of the 42 letters she sent to my office. I had instructed my assistant to shred them unopened. I did not need to know her regrets. I did not need to hear her apologies. Apologies are for mistakes. What she did was a choice. But on the night of the opening, the past tried to knock on my door one last time. As the guests began to fill the ballroom below, my head of security approached me on the balcony. He was a large, quiet man who knew better than to ask unnecessary questions. He told me there was a woman at the service entrance claiming to know me. He said she did not have an invitation, but she insisted it was urgent. He didn't have to say her name. I knew. I could have told him to send her away. I could have stayed in the penthouse, sipping my drink, high above the mess. But curiosity is a dangerous gravity. I wanted to see. I wanted to verify that the ghost that had haunted my house was truly gone. I took the service elevator down to the loading dock level, the hum of the machinery masking the silence in my mind. When the doors opened, I saw her. Chloe was standing near the security checkpoint, arguing softly with a guard. She looked different. The designer dresses were gone, replaced by a coat that looked thin and worn. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, practical bun. She looked older, tired, the lines around her mouth etched deep by stress and regret. She was holding a small envelope. When she saw me, She stopped speaking. The guard stepped back, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. We stood 10 feet apart, separated by concrete and 12 months of silence. She did not rush toward me. She did not smile. She just looked at me with a devastating, raw hunger, not for me, but for the life she had thrown away. She took a step forward and held out the envelope. She whispered that she just wanted me to read it. She said she was working as a receptionist at a dental clinic in the suburbs. She said, I did not take the envelope. I did not yell. I spoke to her in a voice that was calm, steady, and completely detached. I told her that the man she was looking for did not exist anymore. I told her that he died at 3 in the morning a year ago. I told her that I hoped she found peace, but she would never find it with me. Her hand dropped. The hope in her eyes died, replaced by a crushing acceptance. She nodded, once, tears spilling silently down her cheeks. She turned around and walked out the service door, into the alley, into the cold, dark night. I watched the door close. I waited for the pang of guilt, the urge to chase her. It never came. I felt nothing but the cool air of the loading dock. I turned back to the elevator and pressed the button for the penthouse. As the car rose, lifting me back toward the sky, I realized the construction was finally complete. I hadn't just built a tower. I had rebuilt myself. I was no longer the steady, trusting husband who could be fooled by a smile. I was something harder, sharper, more structural. I was a man who knew the load-bearing capacity of loyalty and the breaking point of lies. I walked back out onto the balcony. The party was in full swing. Jazz music drifted through the air, mixing with the laughter of the city's elite. Robert Sterling was there, sitting in a wheelchair in the corner, a shadow of the titan he used to be. He caught my eye and raised a glass. It was a gesture of surrender, of respect. He knew the torch had passed. He knew his era was over and mine had begun. I walked to the edge of the railing and looked out at the city. The grid of Chicago spread out before me, a magnificent board of electricity and concrete. I took my phone out of my pocket. I scrolled to the contact list. I found the entry for Chloe. I pressed delete. Then I found the entry for Robert Sterling. I pressed delete. I was clean. I took a sip of the champagne. It was cold and crisp. A woman walked out onto the balcony. She was an architect from a partner firm, brilliant, sharp-witted, someone I had been working with on the Meridian project. She asked me what I was looking at. I turned to her, and my smile was genuine for the first time in a year. I told her I wasn't looking at the past. I was looking at the view. The wind picked up, howling through the steel spires, but the building did not sway. It was anchored deep, built to withstand storms, built to last. I had survived the collapse. I had cleared the rubble. And now, standing at the top of the world, I finally understood the lesson. You cannot build a life on the foundation of someone else's approval. You have to pour your own concrete. You have to own the ground you stand on. I checked my watch. It was almost midnight. The night was young, and for the first time in a long time, the darkness didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a blank canvas. I turned my back on the city, finished my drink, and walked back inside to join the celebration. The door closed behind me, shutting out the cold, shutting out the silence, shutting out the ghosts. I was home. And this time, no one had a key but me.